For all my talk of the importance of movement and life in your game, it seems odd that I still don't have an idle animation. So I thought we'd fix that and discuss the importance of it along the way. We'll create two idle animations, one for the character that I use on the channel, and one for the little demon character we created in an earlier video. Out of around 40 platformers that I have in my Steam library, only 3 of them don't have an idle animation: Jump King, Broforce, and The Messenger. These games still have idle poses, and we can see even for these one of the most consistent tropes in making an idle pose. They all face quarter profile. This is done to make the character feel more rounded, but also indicate the direction the character is facing. We can see the importance of this here, where if I take the mushroom character and face it forward, it looks quite awkward having it stare at us. Plus, it doesn't actually make any sense. We expect the character to look in the direction we are facing. But if we have it face complete profile, it makes sense gameplay-wise, but the character feels very flat. So almost all games default to quarter profile. It makes sense gameplay-wise, and it also makes the character feel more 3D. The second thing we can see in both hand-drawn characters as well as pixel art characters is that the designs are fairly simple. If you want to animate it in 2D, you generally don't want to make it too complex, because it becomes a terrible chore to animate it, and the character can easily become too busy and look quite bad. I've covered all of this in 2 of my videos on character design, because our starting point for this video will be those designs. But one thing I haven't entirely covered is the idle pose itself. Most games have passive poses, sort of the one you would expect someone to have while waiting at a bus stop. There are some exceptions, such as SteamWorld Dig and Ori. One important reason for this is that active poses can easily look off when you aren't in combat. And the reason games like SteamWorld Dig can have active poses is that it fits the character. He's a rugged miner that is always ready to dig. Or like in Ori, it's a nimble, agile, small creature, and we kind of expect its natural state to be sort of bouncy and ready to jump. But for most characters, we kind of expect them to relax, so a passive pose is a significantly more versatile pose. And we can even see some of the games with multiple animations, such as Dust, have an initial pose which is sort of ready for combat, but if you stand around and wait, it eventually moves into a relaxed pose. One of the reasons why things such as posing is important is that it can help explain the character you're playing. One of the best examples of this is Guacamelee. If we look at this pose, not only is it a really strong and nice silhouette, but it also tells the player what personality the character has. He's a sort of strong, proud superhero character. And we don't even need to look at another game to see why this can be valuable. We can see here how much of a narrative difference it makes when we see the same character in a slump sort of fat pose. And we can see lots of games where the pose and movement is heavily considered for narrative purposes. Games like Blasphemous have this really regal movement and pose. Eternal Noctis has a very strong stoic pose, and Gris has this sort of depressed pose, where most of the movement is in the clothes and hair, rather than the character. If we look at the poses for our characters, they're already passive, but it could be worth thinking about before you start your own animation. There's some things we actually need to figure out before we start the animation. For instance, how much should our character move? We see some games such as Gato have very bouncy animation with a lot of movement, whereas games like Gris have very minimal movements. But why would you pick a bouncy animation instead of a rather still one? Well, we can actually see the most obvious reason for this in Gris itself, because the game has a dynamic camera, and in the few scenes when we are very zoomed out, we can barely see the animation. So we can generally see that pixel games and platformers have quite a bit of movement, whereas zoomed in games can afford to have toned down animations. There are definitely exceptions, such as Cuphead, which due to being sort of an homage to the rubber hose animation era, has one of the bounciest animations of any game. Looking at other games can actually be fitting place to start. Take a game with a camera similar to what you're planning in your own game and see how much movement you think would be fitting. Then you place it in that context and compare it. When looking at that game, you can see, do I need more movement or less? There might be a few more things you want to consider before you actually decide on how much movement you want. If we compare games such as Ghost Song and Dead Cells, they're about equally zoomed in, but if we look at their animations, we can see that the animation of Ghost Song is very timid and understated compared to Dead Cells. And if you have played Dead Cells, you know that there are many parts of it that incentivizes you to be active, such as timed rooms that you need to get to in under 2 minutes before they lock. The animation really helps set you in that active mood. Compare that to Ghost Song, which is exceedingly good at making you feel that you're exploring a desolate planet, and that understated pose really helps sell that. And I actually asked a few people I know who aren't into gaming to look at some of these animations to see what they thought. And the first thing one of them mentioned when she saw the animation of Wonder Boy was that she didn't like it, because the amount of movement made it feel too much like a game. It sort of reminded her of Flappy Bird. afterwards, and she compared it to the animation in Ghost Song, which she felt reminded her more of a movie. While I like both types of animations a lot, I kind of agree with her assessment. A game with a lot of movement feels more like a game, whereas less movement tends to feel more realistic and immersive. So now we've kind of looked at how much movement your animation should have, but what type of movements are generally used for idle animations? I'd say that there are mostly three types of movements. We have breathing movements, bouncing movements, and then flowing fabric. We can see games like Blasphemous and Guacamelee with breathing movements. Then we have games like Rogue Legacy and Haiku with a lot of bounce movements. Animation-wise, the biggest difference here is where the movement is kept. So we can see in Blasphemous that it is more of a breathing movement because only the chest and above are animated, and the legs are kept fairly static. Compare that to an animation like Momodora, where the animation literally starts from the toes. But generally we will see the bounce start in the legs, like the one we can see in Rogue Legacy. Then it tends to be very common to animate the fabric in the idle animation. Have a Nice Death is an example of a character that floats and doesn't move much himself, but his clothes carry an immense amount of movement and flow. Similarly, we can see in Grease very fluid fabric movements on a generally quite static character. This type of fabric movement is also commonly added on top of breathing or bounce animations, which we can see in Eterna Noctis for instance, where the character has a very stoic pose, but the cape almost has a life on its own. There are a few exceptions, such as Then This Nye, where you play as a squishy blob, where the animation might even be made using shaders. Lastly, we can see a somewhat specific quirk of games that are hand animated, wherein the artist wants to show the audience that they are hand animating it. Wonder Boy and Hollow Knight are good examples of this. We can see here in Wonder Boy that the animation almost feels like the character is redrawn for each frame, making the lines themselves be sort of fluid, which brings a lot of attention to itself. And we can see the same thing in Hollow Knight, where the cape movement is really rapid and jumpy, and not perfect at all. And this is generally an intentional choice, because we can see other games such as Grease, which is hand animated, but it looks really fluid and smooth. Generally, when I see animations like this, it tells me one of two things. Either the artist kind of likes the hand animated look and wants it to be visible, sort of like how I only made 3 frames to animate this flower. It looks kind of quirky and nice. The other reason could be because it saves a lot of time. If we look at the animated flower, sure, it looks quirky and nice, but I also only had to draw 3 frames. Imagine if I had to hand animate a smooth animation, and it could easily become an arduous task. So if you hand animate it and you lean into making it sort of loose and organic, you can generally save time because you don't have to polish as much. Okay, so now we can actually go into our drawing program and animate our character. I'll animate everything in Procreate, which is mainly because I like the brushes and drawing experience. It is pretty subpar as an animation program, but it is an excellent drawing program overall, so I do all my animations there. If you look at the most common view in my videos, it is quite zoomed in, kind of like in Hollow Knight. It's sometimes more zoomed out depending on the scene. So I personally don't want to go too minimal on my animation, but I also don't want to overdo it in this cartoon style of Cuphead. So perhaps something like Dead Cells or Blasphemous. We want the character to be sort of insecure and depressive. So the perfect thing to do is to look at Guacamelee and then do the opposite. If we take a look at what that animation does, it sort of goes to a straight posture when he breathes out, but then when he breathes in, it goes to an even greater superhero pose. So what we're going to do for our insecure mushroom is to start from a normal pose, and then when the mushroom breathes out, it slumps down even more. So even though we're only doing a breathing animation, we can still think about how we can use the animation to explain the personality of our character. I will generally keep the face consistent throughout the entire animation. We can see this in my current running animation. These flaps swing back and forth, but the face is static, and we can see this in Hollow Knight as well. My biggest reason for keeping the head and facial movement consistent throughout the animation is that I generally feel that those types of animation can reduce immersion. If I were to sit up and bob up and down with each breath, it looks somewhat natural. But if I were to bob up and down and smile and blink every 10th of a second, it would feel kind of awkward. And so in my opinion, and hopefully yours too, it tends to be better and just keep it static and not open up for those type of awkward looks. So what I'll do is I'll just copy and transform the head for the entire animation. When starting the animation, the head movement is also the first thing that I start with. So I'll add the head on a separate layer. And what I'm going to do here is sort of pose to pose animation. What that means in this case is that the pose that I start creating are the first frame and then the last frame. So this is the straightest our character will be, and this is the most slumped position. Straightest, most slumped. And those are the first we start creating. The reason I start with the head is that it helps me figure out how much my character is going to move overall. And it also helps me contain the animation. So now I know that my animation is going to exist between these 2 frames. And the jump is not going to be bigger or smaller than this. And now we'll draw the body for the slump position. The main thing I consider here is that I'll start with the straight position, and then I just think when I'm moving my body and slump it, what is happening. The main thing is actually just my shoulders going down. And so we kind of want to do that. And if we think about if I have a cape on and I go straight, then the fabric of the cape is going to move up a bit. But when I slump, the fabric of it is going to move down a bit. We'll also add some movement to the arms to sort of follow along, because the arms might move a bit when we're breathing. And as we said, we want a bit of movement, so we're overdoing it compared to what I would do. But by the end of it, we have this starting animation and then this end animation. So we have two poses. And in this case, the pose to pose is because we have these two keyframes. These are the poses that matter. And then we're just going to animate between them. So we're going to make all the in-between frames. So what we're going to do next is we'll just draw the middlemost of these positions. And this is why it's so valuable to have onion skinning in your software. What it does is that it shows you the previous frame as red and then the next frame as green. So you can easily draw in between frame by just drawing your line in between the red and the green frame. And now we can just scroll through the frames to see if it works. If it still feels too jagged, which it does at the moment because we only have 3 frames, then we can create more in between frames between each pose until we have a nice cool animation. So what I'll do is I'll just flip back and forth between 2 frames, add one in between them, and then using onion skinning I'll draw between those 2 frames. And then I'll continue doing this until it doesn't look jagged anymore. I don't generally care too much about whether I have 4 or 24 frames. I tend to just add the least amount of frames I feel are necessary to get the animation the way I want it to be. What this means is I'll slow it down to the type of speed I want it to move, and then I'll check if it's too jagged. And if it's too jagged, then I'll add more frames. When I'm checking my animation, I have it set to ping pong the animation. So in most animation software, you have it to either ping pong or loop. What ping pong does is that it makes the animation play back and forth rather than repeat itself. So the ping pong goes back and forth, whereas the loop goes whoop and starts over whoop. So we'll go to my last frame and then cycle all the way back to the start. This kind of makes sense for an idle animation and makes it so that we only have to animate half as much. But since we're essentially playing the animation backwards half the time, it won't really make sense for a running animation, since it will make it look like your character is running backwards half the time. When I have my main movement laid out, I'll add the small fabric and flappy bits. The reason I do them after my main movement is that these will generally be out of sync from my main animation, which makes sense if you think about it. They have some inertia and they aren't attached to me, so when I move quickly, it will take some time for it to catch up. So it'll be easier to just think about and consider how these flappy bits fly if you already have an animation that you can look at. And frankly, even at this point, we can place our animation in-game to see how it looks. In the actual scene, we can get the sense of if the animation is working well or not. On top of looking at it to see if the breathing and movement feels nice, we can also check to see if the movement is too rapid or not. Since we can alter the speed of the animation in Godot, I just tend to check it here and adjust it to the most fitting animation speed. I can do this in Procreate as well, but in the scene I can get the sense of it in the right context, because it'll be zoomed out the way I need it to be. And if it looks too jagged at this speed, then I'll go back and add more frames. And after some tinkering, we can see that while the breathing movement kind of works, this leg movement on the left side is way too overdone and doesn't fully make sense. I was planning on it to be sort of the wind, but it kind of just looked ridiculous. So I go back and reduce it. Since we're almost done, we can color it in and then go back and see if it works in game. None of this is particularly smooth. I make a lot of errors and I redo my frames multiple times. But now we have sort of something that works as a mushroom character, so we'll move on to the demon character. So for my demon character, the process will generally be the same. I'll start moving the head. Personally, I'm planning to have a camera somewhat similar to Lumione. But if you look at the normal scene in Lumione, the movement is kind of hard to see. So I think personally I want it to be a bit more movement. Actually kind of close to the movement of our mushroom. However, for this character, I don't want it to be particularly depressed. So what I'll do different is that I'll do my main pose and consider it the neutral pose, and then make the last frame be slightly lower and the first frame be slightly higher. So we're animating this pose that I'm having right here, and then I have one pose that is slightly higher and back to the neutral pose, and then one frame that is slightly lower. The reason I approach it this way is that it ensures that the average position will be the height of my original pose. Because if you compare it to the mushroom character, since it slumps down, I've actually reduced the average height of the character. But I don't want to do that in this case, so I'll start from the neutral position and make my middle frame first. And compared to the mushroom character, I won't tilt the head. So generally, tilting the head up will make the character feel proud and stout. And tilting it down, we get this sort of meek and depressed look. If we just skip tilting it, then I think we can make our character look a bit dumb, but well-meaning. You know, sort of randomly bouncing up and down. That's the thought at least. I'll do a bit of a different approach here, which I think is significantly easier. body, I'll simply use the warp tool. The reason I use the warp tool is that it ensures that the lower half of my body stays roughly where I need it to stay, and I won't have to redraw it too much or think about anatomy. Often when you make bounces, you might want to ensure that we get these joint movements to show that the bounce is starting from the knees. But if you consider my actual pose, there really aren't any distinct joints or knees that I could draw or alter. So if I was to try, then it would either ruin the illusion of this character making sense, or I would have to change the character. So creating the bounce using the warp tool is a good way to hide the issue entirely. I'll keep as many parts of the body consistent as possible, but if we look, there are a few things to my design which is intended to move. We have these flappy ears up here, and then we have these curls here, and then we have the arms and the tail. We can see when I animate the ears, one of the benefits of showcasing our hand animated style, because I don't need to make it perfect. I move it slightly up and down, but even if the line art doesn't perfectly line up with the previous frame, it gets this sort of organic, imperfect look, which if we lean into it enough, looks entirely intentional, but it affords me the ability to make mistakes, and I do a lot of mistakes. Making everything too clean will tell the viewer that I want my art to be clean, and then every time something is left unpolished, the viewer will see that as a mistake. But if I just leave in small mistakes or wavy line art constantly, they'll see it and go, well, he obviously knows what he's doing, so he wants it there, it's intentional. I did the tail several times over, but I quickly realized one of two things. If you look at me trying to animate this over and over, we can see that I fail at getting this tail movement looking good. The second part of it is that this distinct heart shape causes issues, because if it moves around, we expect to see it from different angles. But if it constantly looks like a heart, it looks like the tail isn't flapping around, but more like it's waving at us, which honestly looks quite bad. So we have two options. Either we start looking at references, we could film ourselves trying to move an object the way we want the tail to move, and then draw it based on that reference. Or we could learn from a reference of an animal tail or something similar. The second option is to simplify the tail. My process tends to be this. If I think it's truly necessary to make the tail work, then I'll do it. But if I can simplify it without any real loss, then that is the better option. So the first approach I do here is to simply cut the tail short, because I know that the heart and this curl is really the thing that is causing the issue, since it informs the viewer that I don't understand 3D. But if I cut the tail, you no longer see any attempt at making it 3D, and it kind of makes sense. When I'm done, I drop this animation into Godot to see how it looks. And we'll get this looking kind of okay. So we can go back and clean the line art and then color in the new frames. I get some of these jerky movements around the eyes and the patch on the stomach. This is because I haven't perfectly aligned the colors with the previous frame, since I copy it from frame to frame and then warp it. I think that this might be one of those things that I might keep in for now. I'm not entirely sure whether it adds an organic feel or if it looks unpolished. But the thing is, I'm never fully happy with any of the art I do. But after I worked on it and given it a try, I let it sit and then I come back to it in the future. Because time away from the project will give me perspective on whether it is an issue or not. As an example, when I made my staging scene, I tried focusing on the core idea of where you might place your main background assets to maximize parallax, but then I completely overlooked working on the background, so it looked really flat and empty. But eventually this bugged me a lot, so before I started my video on environment animations, I went back into the scene and fixed it. And we can see if I compared the two, the difference it made. And that tends to be the process I work through. I don't like the idea of trying to perfect things, because you would simply never get things done. So the animations aren't perfect, but with some time and perspective, I'll probably figure out how and if I need to fix it. I kind of intended to only make one video where I updated all my animations at once. But yeah, here we are. Thanks for watching. Bye.